I'm going to talk about some things that are coming next week and next month. So next week we will have another Fly meeting. For those of you that were at last week's meeting, awesome. For those of you who would like to come next week as well, Fly is Friends for Literacy Improvement. It's a restart, or we're rejuvenating that group this spring semester. There's a group that, what's that?
Reboot.
A reboot. It's a reboot, Lindsay tells me. Next week, when we are in our second meeting, we will be electing officers, and we will be brainstorming what we would like for our mission to be, where we would like to go with this, what fundraising opportunities we might like to take advantage of for Fly. Some other things that Fly will be involved in is continuing this series that we're starting today with Daryl, as well as starting a summer reading program this summer and a reader's advisory here in the library. So basically just a group of readers on campus who are recommending books to other readers on campus. All right. Next month for the second lecture, Jim Fox, our OEZ English instructor, will be presenting about his own writing. The tentative title of the book that he's working on is A World Without Oreos. So he's going to talk it's a memoir, and he's going to discuss 70s and 80s Philadelphia suburban living, guns, John Wayne and macho stuff, and the Marine Corps and the Persian Gulf War in his writing, and he's going to bring some items to share with us from his work. So that should be really interesting for all of us. Troy,
can we have Oreos for snacks?
We can.
No, we can't. It's a whole story.
That's so easy. Yes, I can do that. Oh, and I should tell you, all of the coffee is full of caffeine, so don't drink it. There's one that has a little thing on top of it to cover up the D that was marked on it, D for decaf. All of it is caffeinated coffee.
Okay.
And I make me strong coffee.
Euro coffee.
Euro coffee, for sure. Does anybody have any questions for me about Fly or anything? Else?
This might be a group to mention Nerd Club too. 3:30 is on Thursday.
Nerd Club, maybe a club?
Nerd Club.
Yeah.
So that's you, okay.
Yeah.
And
Is it
Larry.
Troy?
Us.
Yeah, all three of us here actually, all three of the senior
People who are here.
So Nerd Club meets every Thursday in room 189, is that correct? From 3:30.
3:30 till a while.
A while.
Yeah.
Okay, 3:30 until later. And
Question mark.
I think they talk about gaming and gaming.
We play video games and board games.
board
and
games.
Hang out.
we're working on some field trips,
Yeah.
including to WizardCon in Cleveland and some places in Columbus.
Yeah. It's a fun group. It's the largest group on campus too. Living it up.
So show up to that.
People defected from the history club to go to nerd club that met that reason. Yeah, it's an interesting Venn diagram cross section.
You're all set. Maybe that's good now.
Okay,
Cool,
we're ready
thanks.
to go?
Awesome.
Thank you. Oh, and I should introduce Daryl.
I can do it.
Man who needs no introduction. But I'm bummed.
Yeah, is this my little clicker?
That's your clicker.
Alright, let's see.
Okay.
I can do it. Yeah, my name is Daryl Legacy. I am an English instructor at Zane State, and I like video games a lot, and so I thought this was a good chance to talk about both, kind of. One thing also with the Nerd Club thing you mentioned, I also am a DM for Dungeons and Dragons, so maybe if I ever need to do another talk, I will talk about Dungeons and Dragons. Actually, one of the things that our department had talked about was some people in prison actually run Dungeons and Dragons in prison, and they're not allowed to have dice because of gambling like restrictions and rules. So they have to find something that they can use instead. So a lot of times they'll use either like intricate combinations of coin flips, or they'll actually make sort of fake dice out of paper, which I don't know how that's allowed, but real dice aren't. But anyway, so that is something that maybe I'll talk about a little bit later. And one thing you'll notice with a lot of, maybe you'll notice with a lot of the games that I mentioned here, most of them are role-playing games. They They are predominantly sort of sci-fi or fantasy role-playing games. I do think there probably are some connections to literature with sort of more first-person shooter, non-role-playing game type games, but it's not my normal type of game, so it's harder for me to find that. So I kind of went with what I knew and what I've played, and it made it a little easier. But I do think, I mean, certainly Mass Effect, which I'll mention a little bit, is kind of in between. I don't know how much literature there is in Call of Duty, but maybe there's some. Could be a little, maybe, right? Maybe a little bit. So we'll see. So I came up with sort of a nerdy title. I could be like I could be immediately into the nerd club. I just called it World of Lorecraft, the relationship between video games and literature. Does anybody know what game that is? You should know probably.
Fallout 4.
Yeah, Fallout 4, yeah. So that's Fallout 4, just as a little background. So that'll actually be a little bit. I'll mention that a little bit. How about that one?
Skyrim.
Yeah, there's Skyrim. It's funny actually. I just saw recently somebody posted like a super high resolution image of a Skyrim picture in a nature subreddit in Reddit, and like it stood for a long time as people thinking it was like a real place.
That's awesome.
I mean, it's like it's basically photorealistic now. So that's something interesting. So here's a quote that I just wanted to start because I thought it was really interesting. This is James Paul G. He said, "Video games give a sense of control and flexibility that life often denies." And I thought that was like a very strong reason probably why most people play video games, including me. So here are the 5 topics that I want to just sort of mention. Video games based on literature. Literature about video games, there's only one good example that I had. Literary references in video games of literature within them, which I think is maybe the most interesting, and then video games as art or literature, which we'll see if you guys find that pretty interesting too. So games inspired by literature, there are tons. I only picked a couple because I thought these were sort of, I don't know, kind of interesting ones. So you have these 3 games, which I'll go through a little bit here. Dante's Inferno, which is a 2010 game, which is very, 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 very loosely inspired by, not even loosely based on, but loosely inspired by Dante Alighieri's 1320 epic poem. The thing I find so funny about this is it's very, I don't know if I'd call it an esoteric piece of literature, but it's not a piece of literature that most people are reading, even in English, let alone in the original language. And so it's kind of funny to me to think that we'd have a video game based on that. In reality, it's basically, God of War, just like sort of reskinned, essentially.
Yeah,
so,
pretty much.
but what's really funny about it is they have Dante in there. Dante is this sort of kick-ass superhero with like I think it's a scythe. And Virgil's in there. But then the really interesting thing is actually some of the sinners. Like if you actually read Dante, if you read the Inferno, a lot of it is basically just pot shots at people that Dante did not like. And so that's in the game. So you have this guy here, Filippo Argenti, which is in the original. And it says, angry politician who opposed Dante's return to Florence. Their families were bitter rivals, and Argenti stole from Dante's family after he left Florence, which is like pretty close to the original. So they didn't just leave all of that stuff out, they did actually put some in, which I find really interesting, and I don't know how many players of that game know that that's actually in the original. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing. The Witcher is a really, really big one. This is actually a picture my brother sent me from his PC. I'm envious of how fast it is and how strong it is. So another one that's like, you know, pretty photorealistic. I mean, we're pretty close, I think, to having it be almost indistinguishable from real photos. So these are, and a lot of people I don't think realize that these are actually based on an earlier series of books. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name. Sapkowski, we'll just say. This author, I think he's a Polish author, and he had a whole series of books that these are based on, and they're pretty closely based. I would say much more than the Dante one. So they're much more closely based than that. But he has this funny quote that I just read recently, where he says, "Seeing a picture from the game on the cover of my book, many fans assumed that the game was first, and respectable fans of sci-fi and fantasy hold such derivative books in contempt." So he's actually annoyed that people assume that his book is based on the game instead of the other way around. Which, if you've ever seen some of the books that did come out after the game in the bookstore, books based on, I don't know, Assassin's Creed, or books based on Call of Duty, or Halo. Halo is a good example. Books that are based on the game like years afterwards, they tend to not be phenomenal. So he is annoyed that his book, which he sees as being great, is lumped in with those other types of sort of post-game literature. This is my favorite one. This one's called Evergene, which is based on Jane Austen's novels, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Emma. It's actually not based on the content and the plot of the novels. It's more based around the atmosphere and the sort of environment of the novels. It's an MMO, and it's about to come out, so if you love Jane Austen, this is for you. It comes out this year actually, and it's basically, I even love the references. It says, it's not about kill or be killed, but invite or be invited. Gossip is our weapon of choice. So I'm very curious to see how this goes, because I think, I don't think there are a lot of MMOs that tend to stray away from the sort of really macho kind of kill everything as fast as you can, and also the sort of grinding nature of many MMOs. So I will be really curious to see if this ends up different or not, or if it even comes out, because I feel like lots of games, have a great start and then they never actually come out. So we'll see. Literature about video games. If you've not read Ready Player One, especially if you are between the ages of like 30 and 40, you should absolutely go read it right now. Like,
Yes.
Just go get it. They probably have it here in the library. If you don't, you should get it.
Writing it down.
It's such a good book.
That's getting a movie adaptation.
Yes, and it's gonna be a movie in 2018, actually. Yeah. So it's and this was his first novel. It's like a phenomenal debut novel, and it basically this protagonist is set in the future, and he has to essentially to win a sort of competition that is happening. He has to play all these classic video games, and he has to become really expert at all of them. And there's a lot of really specific details in the games about tricks for the levels and how to beat them and things like that. But it's also just a really interesting, I wouldn't call it a superhero type book, but a really interesting kind of adventurous sort of
And it's set in Ohio.
dystopia. Yes, that's right. Yeah, and they do travel around. There's some interesting sort of gender bending parts of it with H. So yeah, I mean, it's awesome. Go read it and then wait, I guess, for the movie. I feel like they announced the movie like a couple years ago and it's still not out, so we will see. But it's a really good one.
What if you're outside the age range?
You can go play all those games first. And then, you might have played those games. It's better if you're older, probably, because then you will
Actually,
at least seen them.
even up to 50. It was right in my.
Oh, there you go. Right in your wheelhouse.
Right in all the references you'll get.
Yeah, there you go. So Zork and Pac-Man. All right. So, and actually, sadly, I just heard that the founder of Namco just died actually a couple days ago. So, he was in charge when they made Pac-Man. All right. So here are the ones that are literary references in video games, and this is actually what made me want to do this as my presentation. This is what started because I noticed in playing these games, like, oh, that's a funny reference. I wonder how many people get that, and oh, like, what a weird thing to put in that game. And so I thought originally I was going to just have like tons and tons of these, and that was going to be the whole thing. And then I couldn't find as many as I wanted. So eventually I expanded into these other elements here, and I think actually those can be a little more interesting. So the two Fallout games, and really the whole Fallout series, The Witcher 3, and probably the whole Witcher series, and then Dragon Age Origins. There are other ones as well. So here's one of my favorite ones. So I don't know if you can click on the link or not, but there's a part where the Mr. Handy Robot reads this poem. I think that I probably put it down before. We'll see if it works. And if it doesn't, it's okay. I don't know it by heart, so I can't do it. Maybe you does.
He's my boss, so I don't know what they do in business.
Yeah, don't mess with it, right?
One of my
If he
sons.
breaks it, then it's his fault.
Hey, Daryl.
Yeah.
Isn't that also a Ray Rutgers?
It is. If you wait, you'll
Oh,
see.
sorry.
No, it's okay. That's okay. Yeah, his is actually based on the poem.
Yeah.
A reference to the poem. It's not a big deal if it doesn't work.
I've read the story, I haven't read the poem.
Yeah, the poem's short.
The poem is in the story, or piece of it?
Yeah, the house reads it to the kids, even though they're gone at that point.
Oh yeah, isn't that one about the bomb gets dropped
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
everyone's wiped out, but the
So
house is
I can
still
just
standing.
explain it. It's really not like totally necessary. I just like the robot voice for the poem. It's not a huge deal. I'll explain it if you guys get to work, great. If not, no big deal. But in the game itself, if you don't know Fallout, all the Fallout games are set after a nuclear apocalypse. Isn't really the right word. Like a nuclear war basically happens in the future between the U.S. and China, I think it is. So you're essentially in this dystopian world where everything has been kind of bombed out. Oh, I think it probably maybe it went to the
Yeah,
next
it
slide.
ought to play to another video.
So it is literally like a bombed out nuclear wasteland. Hence the term Fallout. I don't think that's it.
Just hit the back button.
Yeah, maybe that.
Those trackpads are horrible.
There it is. I don't know if you can hear it. It probably hasn't started yet. Oh, sorry. You actually can start it at 50. In the original link, it had 50. per 50 seconds. And it's not a big deal. Well, at least
Well, see, now it's a mission.
Yeah.
Now we have to get it
It's
working.
like playing a video game.
Yeah.
So essentially, this is like this is one of the sort of house servant robots that existed before the war happened. Let's see if you hear it.
Buffering.
That's okay. You get the point. So essentially, he's reciting this poem that's like detail from 1920, which is actually about World War I, and it's about the sort of their version of the wasteland that happened in Europe after World War I. Then Ray Bradbury wrote a book or a short story about it in the I think 60s, where you have this house that is like a fully automated house that makes breakfast and it cleans and it does all these sort of automated tasks, and the description of it. I know. The description of it is interesting because there are no people left. Like everything's dead except for the house, but it continues to do all these things like making breakfast and cleaning. And I think it actually reads that poem to the kids. I think that's where the reference comes from. And then it like starts a fire and the whole house burns down.
Where does it get the breakfast if there's nobody restocking the house?
I think it eventually runs out, but it must have a lot. I guess built up like toasted eggs, and I don't know how long it's been in that story. Maybe only a few weeks or something. I think the dog is still alive.
The dog's still there, but the dog's starving.
Yeah, the dog is starving. So it's been weeks at that point, probably at least, but not like years. So I guess shortly after. Yeah, it's a really interesting short story. If you're interested in dystopia, that kind of thing, it's really really good. I definitely recommend it. All right, so that's the reference to There Will Come Suffering. So essentially, that robot is doing what the house kind of does, which is continuing to take care of things after all the people are dead and gone. So it's sort of this double reference where it reads the poem, but also it's doing what the actual short, 1950 actually, what the short story did. All right, so, okay, this is the one that I first recognized when I was playing. I don't know why. I love Cats Go Amontillado, which is a Poe story. So I don't know, you don't need any sound for this, so it might work. But if you don't want to, that's okay. Essentially, what happens, you can try it, we'll see if it goes. This is in Fallout 4.
Buffering.
That's all right. It's all right if it doesn't work. So in Fallout 4, I think it's the Armory, I think that's what it's called, basically the castle, there is a point where if you go down in the tunnels, you find this little like crate of, I think it's mostly wine. It just says like wine bottle, wine bottle, wine bottle, and then one in the back corner says Amontillado. And then if you keep going around the side, the wall, like a bunch of the bricks have fallen down, and you see a skeleton like chained inside the wall. And that's all it does. It doesn't say anything else, doesn't explain anything, that's all it is. But it's a reference to this Poe story where it ends, I'm going to spoil it for you 170 years later. It ends with the protagonist, I guess, or narrator, however you want to call him, breaking up his sort of friend in the basement in the mausoleum of his house in Italy. Maybe not for a good reason, it's hard to tell. And so he just leaves him in there, and he basically just says, no one will find you here. And then we don't need it, that's okay. And then it ends with him saying, it's been 50 years and no one has found him. So like, clearly the protagonist got away with it. But that's what happens, where he's chained up and bricked up, basically, alive in the story. So that's what Fallout is making that reference to it. Don't click on this one because it'll take forever. But there's a Simpsons reference to that as well. If you remember the one where Mr. Burns loses the plant to Homer, and Homer becomes like CEO of the plant, I think this is also the one where he says, like, terror alert Vermilion. Homer becomes the CEO of the plant, and then Burns like wants it back, so he's pretending like he's talking to him about why he should give him the plant back, and Homer says like, I think you're right, and then he shoots him with a tranquilizer dart, and Homer like falls asleep, and Mr. Burns goes to brick him up in his mausoleum, but he's like too weak, and so by the time the morning comes around and Homer wakes up, he's only gotten like 7 bricks done. Homer just like walks over it and leaves. So. But it's funny. If Simpsons does that a lot, they have the Treehouse of Horror one where they also did the Raven. They have a lot of like little clever references to literature. So it's not really a video game, but it was good to throw it in there. So Witcher 3, there are tons. There are like dozens and dozens and dozens. So I just picked some that I thought made references to sort of classic literature. And there are lots of TV shows and movies. So this is the quote on the notice board in case you can't see it. It says, "If you see a white whale in the sea, let it swim on. It's mine. If anyone catches it before me, Freya be my witness. I will stab that wretch to death with my harpoon." So what's the reference?
Moby Dick.
Yeah, Moby Dick. Moby Dick. Which is funny because who's the one that's actually obsessed with the whale in Moby Dick? It's not Ishmael.
Ahab.
It's Ahab, yeah. But Ahab's dead, I guess. So
You'd think Ishmael would have learned the lesson, though.
yeah, Ishmael will take him up on the answer.
And you can actually end up seeing that whale.
Yeah.
You go and talk to him, it's in the background, and you
Yeah.
try to notify the guy, like,
Yeah.
it's there, and he does
Oh,
not pay
that's funny.
attention.
I didn't even realize that. That's really funny. So I guess he doesn't care that much.
You know, he's just like talking about the story, and Garrett's like, dude, it's right behind you, and then by the time he turns around, it's
It's
gone.
on. I like it. This other one I really like too. So you meet a man named Abbe Faria who escaped from prison by playing dead and being tossed in the sewers. This is a little more obscure. Anybody know this one?
Count of Monte Cristo.
Yeah, the Count of Monte Cristo. So there are tons of these all throughout the game.
That's great.
There's another one where there's a cyclops that has a herd of sheep, which is from the Odyssey. So there are lots and lots of them. I just picked these couple because they were kind of the most interesting. This is one of my favorites too. This is in Dragon Age Origins. You come upon this part where there's these two dead refugees, and one of them has a note that says, "Why, oh, why didn't we just take the flying eagles?" Everybody jokes about that in Lord of the Rings. They say like, well, "Why didn't they just have the eagles take them out too? Why did they like go on foot?" And so even though that's not in the text of the Lord of the Rings, it's a debate that people have been talking about and laughing about for a long time. It's probably right up there with why are stormtroopers such terrible shot. And so, which I just read an interesting article on actually. So that's a reference to the Lord of the Rings. But again, like if you didn't know that, you wouldn't even see it. Like you would see it and just say like, I don't know what that means. Oh well, and you would just go on. So some of them are much more subtle than some of the other ones. All right, so here are the video games with literature within, which I think is probably is more difficult in terms of for the makers of the video games. This is done with intention. Those other ones you can just kind of throw things in, you know, a couple little references here or there, and it's not something that is maybe that difficult to do on top of making the game. These ones are very different. So the Elder Scrolls, all of them, The Witcher 3, Dragon Age Origins. Elder Scrolls especially has tons, you don't need to click on it, but there are tons and tons of books and scrolls and journals. And the thing that's so interesting about the books is that, and really all that is someone flipping through the book in the game. Some of them are 6 or 7 or 8 pages of this book, which could be easily, 300-400 words of actual text. And you don't need to actually read them for the game. Like, there's no reason to have to read it. If the book is going to give you any reward or anything, just opening it is enough. You don't have to actually flip through. You certainly don't need to read every word. And you don't get any reward for that. But the designer of Elder Scrolls, one of the Elder Scrolls designers said, we often make nods to real-world literature for a variety of reasons depending on the writer. So they have lots of people that write the actual book within the game. And there are tons of them. I think Skyrim had like 270 books or something in the game. And lots of people read them all. And there's a wiki that gives the explanation of every single one of them and tells you what it says and what it refers to. And there are sometimes really interesting, like, subtle references within the text of that book to either other parts of the game or to other games or to things in literature. It's really interesting. I mean, that's a lot of work to both write and then code all of these books just as like an interesting little aside. The Witcher does that too, not to the same extent. Elder Scrolls, I think, is the master at putting extra stuff in that you don't really need but is interesting. Again, that's just a book. You can flip through. Again, no reason really to read it. I think that one is the reference to, there's a, so one of the books, it talks about the, I forget the wording for it, but it's like an enemy or whatever, a trap in a dungeon, and it says like, or DRM for short. So any like IT people will probably get the DRM reference, right, which is digital rights? Yeah. Which is basically the thing that keeps you from being able to, or you have to log in when you play your game, or you have to log in on Steam. Steam is basically what they're referencing. How you have to be online for a lot of those games. And then it says, but fortunately, there's a big long story. Fortunately, there's this grimoire opening, blah, 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 and it says, or GOG for short, which is a website that sells non-DRM games. So it's like a really weird reference that only like fairly hardcore gamers will get. And it doesn't really mean anything, and it doesn't really do anything. It's just kind of a funny little dig at Steam, partly because they don't like what Steam does in terms of forcing you to log in and have internet access for your own games that you bought. And so it's just like a little dig there at them. Dragon Age, their codex entries, which are sort of like your journal or your quest, I don't know, cataloging, look like real books. And it's something I find really interesting how in this game, which is just like ones and zeros, everything is made to look like a book, right? So they could just make it a sheet of paper or something, but it's made to look like a book, and a lot of them you can actually flip, like in the Skyrim one, you can flip through the book from page to page. So even though in the real world a lot of people are moving to ebooks, in video games we're still using real books, I guess. E-real books or something. Again, you don't need to read them. None of these games have a requirement that you even flip the pages on these books. You don't get anything extra if you make it to the last page. It's just people find it interesting. This one's too bad. This one would have been a good one. I'll just tell you about it. So in the original one, it says Storbacker, and so Storbacker is the bear of the north, blah, blah, blah. And it goes through all these funny compliments, I guess, about Storbacker. And it says, like, Storbacker, tear your arms off, and I heard Storbacker, blah, blah, blah. Basically, it's like rumors and gossip about Storbacker the bear. And it's actually set up, we'll see, this will be an interesting Venn diagram of who gets it, but it's actually set up in the exact same order as several lines of dialogue in Mean Girls when they're talking about
Wow.
about oh god, what is her name?
Regina George.
Regina George. And the funny thing in the Storbacker is the author of the book in there is it's like Reginald de George. So like it's clearly a reference to that, and it's word for word. And the last one in the Mean Girls one is like, Regina punched me in the face and it was the greatest day of my life. And the Storbacker one ends with, that bear clawed my eyes out and it was the greatest day of my life. So it's like a weird reference. And again, like, what's the Venn diagram between plays Dragon Age and like knows Mean Girls well enough to know that's a reference? I can't imagine there's a lot of overlap, but clearly there must be some. All right, so here I think is maybe the most interesting and maybe complicated, complex part is, can video games be art or literature? And lots of people have written about this and probably given lots of presentations. I'm sure I'm not going to be the definitive word on this, but I think it's worth thinking about, and I think it's worth talking about. So the Supreme Court says yes. This is part of that Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association case where they said, like the protected books, plays, and movies that preceded them, video games communicate ideas, and even social messages, through many familiar literary devices, such as characters, dialogue, plot, and music, that suffices to confer First Amendment protection. So essentially this was, Governor Brown of California, and he was trying to argue that, or his lawyers were trying to argue that video games are not protected by the same First Amendment rights as like regular art or literature because they are interactive. That was the whole argument, they're interactive. And essentially the Supreme Court said no, I mean like books are interactive as well. I mean some are literally interactive. If anybody's old enough to remember Choose Your Own Adventure books, right? So those are literally interactive. But even Count of Monte Cristo, like it is interactive, what you take out of it, what your reaction to it is, what you think of it. And so the Supreme Court just said no, it's the same thing. So literally in a legal sense, it is counted as being art or literature. The Smithsonian says yes too, and I was really interested in this one. This was quite a few years ago too, 2012. They had an exhibit called The Art of Video Games. And this quote was from from Chris Melisinos, who was the curator. And he said, video games are the only forms of artistic expression that allow the authoritative voice of the author to remain true while allowing the observer to explore and experiment, which I think is a really interesting sort of reversal of the way we normally think about video games, right? You normally think of a book as like it's printed, it's exactly what the author gave you, and it is exactly the way that he or she wanted it to be. And like it doesn't change, and it is what it is. And you read it, and you get out of it what you want, but it doesn't actually change. And his argument was that this does that too, that video games do that also, but they also let you experiment and sort of play around with it in a way that maybe books don't. They actually had a huge exhibit of all sorts of video games over the past 30 years, up until 2012, at the Smithsonian, and they had all sorts of interesting models and things there. So clearly they thought it was at least worthy of being next to art and next to literature in the Smithsonian. All right, so if you know this argument or this debate, or if you've ever heard of this debate before, you know who the no person is. Does anybody know? who the no, they can never be art person is? You've heard of this person for sure.
Is he the lawyer that tried to destroy GTA?
No, not a lawyer at all, actually. It's Roger Ebert. So, Roger, I think just passed away recently, is that right? I think so, he passed away recently. So he was so vehement about it, and he has this quote, he says, "To my knowledge, no one in or out of the field has ever been able to cite a game worthy of comparison with the great dramatists, poets, filmmakers, novelists, and composers. That a game can aspire to artistic importance as a visual experience, I accept. But for most gamers, video games represent a loss of those precious hours we have available to make ourselves more cultured, civilized, and empathetic." So like a good little dig and burn right at the end there. He was really vehement about it. And then later, a few years later, 2010, he came back to it and he said, well, let me clarify a little bit. People thought he was going to say, yes, finally, he thinks there are video games that are worthy of being called art or worthy of being called literature. And he said, he changed it to say, I think it's theoretically possible, but no one alive today will ever play a game that is actually art. So like, useless as a clarifying comment. He has a really strange definition of video games. He believes that if it has winners and losers and rules, then it can be a video game. And by definition, he thought, well, that can't be art, because it's about winning and losing in competition. And people said, well, what about video games that there is no winning and losing? There are a lot of games like that, especially now, where you don't win or lose, it doesn't ever end, you just explore and do different things. And he said, oh, those aren't video games. Those are something else. And so they can be art. So he had, in my mind, a very narrow and kind of shallow definition of video games that I think he used to try to make his argument that they couldn't be art. Like, there was nothing that was ever going to convince him that anything could be art that was sort of given through a PC or given through a console. So I think, unfortunately, he didn't have a very good argument there. All right, so here are a few examples of games that I would count as either being literature or art or possibly both. And you look at this one and like the graphics are like awful. This is a game that just came out. This was like 2014, so the graphics are intentionally bad. This is a big thing now. It's like retro graphics in video games are now a huge thing. There's like 8-bit games now that look like they came on the original Nintendo or the Atari. And that's on purpose, partly because it's easier and cheaper. But also a lot of developers argue that it forces you to focus on the story rather than the graphics, right? So in Witcher, you could spend a lot of time focusing on how beautiful the art, the art direction and the landscape is, and it might make you miss parts of the story. And so they say, we're not spending any time on graphics. We don't care. Done, right? A couple weeks, and then we're going to spend all the rest of the time trying to make the story interesting. So Papers, Please, anybody heard of this? Yeah. One person, 2 people, awesome, 3 people. So Papers, Please is this really weird little game where your job is to be and this is super timely right now, your job is basically a border control agent in this sort of fictional country. And people come in this line, and they come up to you, and they have a passport, and your job is to either accept them or reject them. And there are different rules that the government tells you about who can and cannot come in. It starts out, they have to be from our country, and then it gets a little more specific, and it says things like, well, they can be from foreign countries as long as they have a valid passport. And the rules get sort of more and more vague and more gray and less black and white. And you don't really ever know if you would accept or reject someone if they are like lying or good or bad. You're just making judgment calls. And you might think, well, I'll just accept everybody. And the problem is that you get paid partly based on like your I guess correct rate of accepting or rejecting, and you have to then go home and have enough money to pay for your family to eat, and for your family to have heat, and for your family to have to be able to afford rent. And so if you just say like accept, your family's going to basically starve to death. So it puts this really weird, difficult moral and ethical choice on you in a video game. I mean, it's such a weird thing when you think about it. And you think, oh, well, those don't even look like real people. But it's very emotional because when you think about the fact that like they could be real people, and this does happen in real life. I mean, somebody's job is to decide who gets to come in or come out of the country. So if you haven't played it, it's a really interesting game, and I think it's maybe only $20. I don't think
15 probably.
15 probably. Probably get it for 15. Probably on Steam actually. Right? So you have to deal with the VR. So I think this is a really sort of interesting ethical one. Here's Stanley Parable. Has anybody heard this one? Same people. It's always going to be the same people. So Stanley Parable I find really interesting as an example of literature, sort of. A game that is literature but also has literature. Essentially, you are an office worker. And your job is, I think it says, like to push the keys on the computer, and the computer tells you how many times and for how long, and push the M key 13 times in a row or hold it, and that's your job. And it's intended to be like a very sort of over-the-top, hyperbolic explanation of office work, right? and you're like in a little office, no windows, whatever. And it says, one day Stanley realized that he hadn't seen anyone else at work, and there were no coworkers. And he had been there for at least an hour. So it says, Stanley got up from his desk and explored the office. And so then you can get up, and you're in control at that point. You can get up and start walking around. But the narrator keeps narrating things that you haven't done yet. So it'll say Stanley decided that perhaps he should check out the break room. And so the idea is then you're supposed to go toward the break room. But you can go a different way if you want. And the narrator gets increasingly snarky and sort of annoyed if you don't do what he's saying. There's one part where there's a red door and a blue door, and he says, Stanley decided to go in the red door. And then if you go in the blue door, it says, it kicks you back out and says, Stanley said you will go in the, or Stanley decided to go in the red door. And then if you do it again, it's fine, I guess Stanley decided he was going to ignore the advice of everyone that knew better than him and go in the blue door. And it's this weird, meta kind of interaction with the narrator who's talking about what you're sort of supposed to be doing. And there are lots of different endings to it as well. And so there's not a right way or a winning way. It's very, very, very odd. It's one of the weirdest ones, even more weird than Papers, Please, I think.
How's everybody gone?
You'll have to play it to find out. So, The Last of Us is probably one everybody's heard of, I'm guessing, maybe. Do you guys all know about the sequel as well?
I've heard there's
Trying to make
guys.
things come.
It
It just
just
officially
got
hasn't been
announced.
announced. So, The Last of Us is probably, of all the games made in the last at least 5 years, it is probably recognized as the greatest, or at least is on the most number of greatest games of all time lists in the last 5 years. And I think many people would point to this one as being an example of a game that is both a blockbuster and also very complex and very deep, and very literature in some ways and very artistic in some ways. It sounds like it wouldn't be because it's basically a zombie game, but the whole sort of game is built in this relationship between Joel and this girl that he comes across who he doesn't even know at the beginning. In a lot of ways, it's almost like a movie, but you're in charge of it, and it's not open world the way some of those other games were, so there is a sort of defined path, but you do have to make choices. And the gameplay is important, but the story is much more important than the gameplay. It's one of those games where if you're just doing it because you like the action, you're missing the most important parts of it. So there's really not any literature in the game, but it certainly does, I think, call back to lots and lots of literature about sort of the collective versus the individual. I'm not going to give anything away in case you haven't played it, but there are some important choices that you have to make about who is more important. Right? Gone Home is another interesting. Anybody heard of this one? Oh, let's see, 2 people, only 2 that time. We're getting lower. So Gone Home is what do they call it? I've heard it kind of derisively called as walking around games, but if we want to say officially, it's an exploration game. Some people actually lump this one in with some others and call them empathy games, and I would say Papers, Please is probably that as well. And those are games that are predominantly a morality ethics question. This is sort of a point-and-click game, which used to be really prevalent years ago. Those were the first sort of 3D games or point-and-click kind of games where you had to walk around and click on things and discover things. There was a Sherlock Holmes game like that. And there's a new one actually like that too. And so you come home to your family house and nobody's there, and your job is to walk around and figure out what happened basically. And it's not a very long game; it only takes a few hours. But there's a lot of weird, interesting things that you find out about what happened. And there's pictures of you there, of your character there. So it's a different kind of style and a different kind of thing. This is one of my favorites. I have not played this yet, but I think I'm going to soon. It's called This War of Mine, and it is probably the first or one of the first games to focus on the civilians during war rather than the soldiers. And so you are basically refugee or civilian in a war-torn area. I think I read that this was based on Syria. And your job is to basically hide and try to scrounge up enough food and medicine to not die. And that's it. And if you come across a soldier, you get killed. There's no shooting, there's no fighting your way out of it. Your job is to just basically hide. And the point of this is to basically get people to be, the point is to make money, but part of the game's point is to get people to have a different perspective, right? You don't see any of the civilians in Call of Duty or Halo or Mass Effect, or, you're the soldier and that's all you see. So you don't get the sense or the perspective of what about the people whose building I just blew up, or what about the people whose office building I just broke into, or whatever. So it's a weird sort of reversal too.
And there is some morality with that one. So if I were scrounging for supplies,
Yeah.
you have this easy
Yeah.
target, soft target of like this elderly couple just outside the
Yeah.
city, and you can just go and
Take
beat up the
your
old man
stuff.
and
Yeah.
take everything
Yeah.
they have.
Yeah.
But as like you leave, you're like, well, I guess we're dead now.
Yeah, I mean basically you just kill them. I think I pushed the wrong button.
There's a
Sorry.
funny glitch with that one too. If you sneak
Oh,
in
really?
the house,
Yeah.
you don't even see the people. If you take all the stuff and don't
Yeah.
even see them, you'll still get like a morality.
Oh, but
Even
you
though
still
didn't
know that
know
you
anybody
stole
was
from
in
that
there.
guy, but you know that you stole from
Yeah,
him.
and like your characters will
Yeah,
have
you know
problems with
about
that.
it.
That's funny. That's really interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's just a different way of thinking about it. These ones are absolutely literary, I think, of literature. So has anybody played any of the Telltale games?
You.
There's Walking Dead, there's Game of Thrones, and then there's the first one that they made, which wasn't based on a show or anything. I can't remember what it's called.
Isn't there a Batman one
Yeah,
also?
there's a Batman.
Oh, is
one,
there? I didn't
Tales
know
of
that.
Borderlands, The Wolf Among Us.
That's the original one, I think.
That
Or
one's-
one of the original ones.
That one's based off the Fables comic.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
That's interesting. So these games are essentially very, very little like actual button mashing action, and it's basically just choices. So they are based on the comic books for Walking Dead rather than the show. Although there are some interesting overlaps. And your job is to just go through, talk to people, decide things, but you don't really like shoot or like hide. I mean, you can do a little of that, but mostly you're just choosing dialogue options and like what to do. And they all have dramatic consequences. And the games can all end, especially I think season 2 is the one that can end in all sorts of different ways. And so, or maybe season 1 is the one that ends in all sorts of different ways. And in season 2, you can actually pick up from where you left off in season 1. And it, like, people die. Like, if you make certain choices, that causes characters to die. And if you make other choices, it causes other characters to die. And it's kind of like this war of mine where you don't decide, like, I'm going to kill him. Sometimes you do. But just by choosing, like, sometimes you have to pick who to save. So there'd be like 2 people who are being attacked by zombies. You only get to save 1. Pick. Now, you have 3 seconds. And so it's a game that's much more about sort of reading the dialogue and thinking about it rather than the action part. BioShock Infinite, oh god, this is such a weird game. If you've ever played any of the BioShock ones, this is the best one, I think. So BioShock Infinite is essentially, it's like the first blockbuster to have all sorts of weird parallel worlds cosmology in it, essentially. So there's all sorts of interesting astrophysics and theoretical physics concepts of parallel dimensions. And although if you watch Me in the High Castle, you get a little of that too. But it's really weird and super complicated and very trippy. And the ending is like you'll think about it for a long, long, long time. And there are also like lots of weird literary references in BioShock Infinite to weird things. Essentially the like sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, it's not really a country, but this like area is sort of based on like an Ayn Randian country. So like if Ayn Rand basically, if all of like Ayn Rand's ideas were used to make the government and society for this place, like what would happen? And actually I think originally BioShock 1 and 2 is maybe more close than this one, but and so, I mean, Ayn Rand wrote books and, you know, was not really a philosopher, was just sort of a writer, and actually has like a huge influence on a lot of politicians now. So, I mean, somebody we probably all should read. And it's interesting that this game is sort of like a gateway for some people to get into reading that and thinking about it. All right, so if you love literature and games, if you just Google video games for literature lovers, there's a huge giant list of games that have literary components to them and interesting literary pieces to it. So if you want, you can look for them later. Okay, so here's the important part, right? Like, so what? Who cares, right? So, okay, video games and literature have lots of overlap, and they each reference each other in weird ways, and it's mildly interesting, but like, does it really matter for anything? So, I'm going to say yes, it does. So I'm going to say that video games are the next great popular literatures, right? So the large, big L, sort of written by, you know, Ivy Leaguers and things, they're not writing video games. They're not making video games for the most part. They're still writing their, you know, complicated great American novels and things like that. But I think the popular literature and the sort of mass literature, I think video games are like the leading edge of that. So here's I say this all the time to my students. I usually say like today's poets are rappers, but I think they're also singers. So like, you know, there are still poets out there, and almost all of them have gone to college and gotten a degree or an MFA or more. But there are also lots of people who essentially are doing poetry, and there always have been, but there are a lot of people now doing poetry without getting a degree or without necessarily having studied it to that extent. And I always tell my students that they're all writing songs now. Instead of just writing poems, they're all writing songs. If you think of even something like 21 Pilots, I think a lot of their stuff is incredibly poetic. I think Fun, to some extent, is poetic. Lots of rappers are extremely poetic in the way they talk about different things, and lots of interesting literary references. Also, maybe Emma remembers, what's the name of the group of the two women? It's not Hall and Oates, is it Garfunkel and Oates?
Yeah,
I think so. Garfunkel and Oates is like the funniest thing ever. If you're ever bored and you have time and not working on a paper, just go to YouTube and search Garfunkel and Oates. It's these two women who have like I don't know what you call it, like a comedy band sort of, and they have really funny, interesting literary references in their music, and they do that a lot. So the poets are singers and the writers are game developers, all right? So all of these games have like teams of people whose only job is to write those texts and those books in The Witcher and in Dragon Age and in Bioshock, and their job is to just write even just the dialogue trees. I mean, some of these games have like thousands and thousands, probably tens of thousands of lines of dialogue. And a lot of times, like, you only go through one path if you only play that game once. And it's probably really hard to get all of the dialogue ever read to you or, sounded out, because you'd have to play the game in a lot of different iterations. So the thing that I really like about it, so a lot of people, I think, bemoan it, and they say, like, oh, they're just playing video games and they're not reading, and it's awful, and it's terrible. And to some extent, I think there is a little bit of truth to that. It would be great if people were doing both. Hopefully they are. But these games require you to be a reader. Like, you can't play The Witcher and like not be willing to read things. You can't play even Fallout. You can't play Fallout and not be willing to read like a fair amount, because even just the quests and the dialogue, and there's a lot of reading that goes on in these types of games. And I think in a lot of ways this is like the gateway to reading for people, right? They read this and it's not that hard, but it sort of sucks them into other literature. And I think that's really, really important. And I think this is a good way for us to get people. I also, this will be controversial maybe, but I think it has a wider direct audience than Melville or Hawthorne or Shakespeare. The number of people who have played one of these games is almost certainly way higher than the number of people who have actually read Shakespeare, like in front of them. Maybe they've seen plays and movies and things, but it's probably still more. I mean, you have millions and millions of people playing these games. And I think they can have a wider reach in some ways. But you say, well, Shakespeare is super influential, and so is Hawthorne, and so is Melville, which is absolutely true. Why is that? So if only a few thousand people, in London could even read when Shakespeare was writing, and maybe only, a small percentage ever saw the plays, why did it become so influential? Why didn't people just say, like, oh yeah, he wrote some interesting stuff? How did it become super important? And how come it still influences things and we still study it? How did that happen? Anybody?
It was popular.
It was popular then, and it's popular now, but how did it get into your minds? Like, how did it get to you?
Real
world issues.
Yeah, but I mean more literally.
Great writing.
Something like it.
Say that again?
He's like the only one that does stuff like.
Yeah, I mean, they're different, it's great writing, but who decided it was great writing? This is the part. Who decided?
Yeah.
Colleges.
The colleges, yeah. Colleges decided that Shakespeare was worthy of us studying. Colleges decided that we should be studying Hawthorne and Melville, and they're right, we should absolutely be doing those, obviously. There were lots of other people. But I think that we should also be studying video games. I think that if video games were being studied in college, we would be taking them a little bit more seriously. And I also think it would make a loop where those games would realize they're being taken more seriously and would be even more careful about making complex literature within the games and making complex references within the games. And I'm sure this is probably happening some places. But I think most video games that are being studied, partly for ethics. I do think a lot of colleges are studying video games for ethics now, which I think is super important. But I don't know any that are yet studying them as literature, like doing an English something class and having it be video games. And I think you could. I think you absolutely could. And I think there are lots of connections that you could make with actual, physical books. So that's my thing. We should be studying it, and I think we're going to be. I think within like 10 years, you're going to see lots of courses that are English courses studying video games in them. And it's not just going to be IT or digital media or art even. And we'll see. We'll see if I'm right about that. All right. By the way, what game is that?
No Man's Sky. No Man's
Which
Sky.
definitely counts as art. A lot of people weren't happy with the game when it came out, but the art of it is like phenomenal.
It's very,
gameplay and all that stuff,
who's the guy who did all the art for Star Wars?
Oh, I don't know.
Corey?
Yeah. I don't know.
Corey.
That's
He
interesting.
did old art.
Oh, that's interesting. So do we have questions or comments or things to think about?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, You mentioned like in Witcher and
Yeah.
the Elder Scrolls that the literature in those